welcome everyone back to the first panel. The panel is mainly titled Digital Surveillance and Privacy Issues in the Age of Social Media. And although it has the word social media, the key word here is surveillance and privacy. I'll take the opportunity, of course, to welcome our three distinguished panelists. Very briefly, Nicholas is well known to be, of course, the policy director at Google, but also an academic, and that's what I noted in the way he presented really concrete, factual information. But he also has experience in both Europe and Sweden. He was at the Swedish advisory boards as well as an expert in groups concerned with the commissioner and ministerial levels, and contributes to several newspapers, trade organizations, and other publications. So he's a writer. And that's another link we have with him from journalism. He's taught and given seminars on internet and law for more than 10 years on topics ranging from information, standards, security, and the philosophy of privacy to the public, to the politics of copyright. And you can also see from his presentation he's experienced in areas of noise in terms of cyberspace. So that's Nicholas. I'll also introduce Lena, of course. She's a journalist at the Swedish television, SVT, Foreign News Desk, and works as a host for the TV program, The Correspondenterna, which addresses global issues through human stories. Through the TV program, Lena reports about global issues in a way that depicts the context, but with a personal narrative that reflects a sense of journalistic curiosity and commitment. Last but not least, there's Dean Marcinchen, and he is the co-founder of the G Media Center in Geneva. He has experience as a guest lecturer in communications at the UN and the University of Business and International Studies in Geneva. He's a consultant and training officer for WHO and UNICEF in Geneva as well. He was responsible for developing, contributing to the new media initiatives on human rights and migration programs for Geneva-based NGOs. And he has several years of experience in organizing strategy and development in the private sector. So those three distinguished panelists will be discussing the topic of surveillance and privacy. I'll begin in the given order with Nicholas. And as we heard earlier, there is a claim, or there's an opinion or premise, that surveillance is not necessarily a bad thing. There could be reasons to have surveillance. But the question that arises, that one comes up with considering the situation of journalists today, is that how can journalists trust in services that present a particular premise, or that's the condition saying that there is privacy in some sense, that at least there is no third-party spying, while eventually discovering something like what happened in the Snowden revelations. So how could journalists react to this?
I think the question of trust is absolutely fundamental to our relationship with technology overall and to services that employ technology in different ways. And I think that it's a fair question because I think the Snowden revelations shook everyone's trust, not only in the services, but actually in the governments that conducted this kind of surveillance. And I think that's something that we saw profoundly in the US and we've seen in Europe to varying degrees across different countries. And so I think that the answer to the question is that as a company, we have to commit to making sure that our users are secure and that they can trust us. And if you follow the reactions in the newspapers, we've seen our chairman say, for example, he was outraged of the attacks against our data centers. Quickly, we made sure that we encrypted the connections between them. And Eric Gross, who's the head of security with us, said that this seems to be an ongoing arms race, and we are going to go in this arms race so far as we can to protect our users. Now, that's only one part of the answer, right? That we can build secure technology and we can make sure that we protect our users as much as we can. The other answer to that question, and expand the security technology all the time, the other answer is that we should also hold ourselves accountable through, for example, the transparency report. And then we should also hold ourselves accountable to actually drive public debate. I mean, this is a great example of that. We participate in debates like this across the world. We've been part of developing what we think are at least a good starting set of principles that can be discussed. And we have repeatedly written to the Obama government and asked them to implement several changes to the legislation that enables surveillance. I've personally been in the European Parliament, answered questions about this, because I do believe that's our responsibility. And I think that, in the end, those three things, building secure technology, making sure that we react very forcefully when we are attacked in different ways, and then making sure that we also drive our own accountability through both what we do in public fora and the services that we develop, is essentially the basis of our approach to this. And then there are other things too that we're doing. We're doing a little bit of judicial activism to be able to disclose more, more detail. And we have a number of court cases, for example, in the US, where we've challenged decisions to essentially, we began with this in 2006, where we were asked by the Ministry of, the Department of Justice to hand over 1 million searches or something like that, because they wanted to, and hold your breath now, they wanted to see if people watch porn on the internet. And yes, you need 1 million searches to figure that one out. So we said no, we said it was an overbroad request, and from that point on, 2006, we've consistently been challenging requests that we think are wrong, are overbroad, are ill-formed, and we've continued to do so along the lines of our commitment to our users.
Okay, thank you. Now, Lena, as a practicing journalist and someone who has been following the issue from afar, perhaps the United States, you've been covering international stories. Do you believe that such a reaction is enough? And if it is, what is the role of journalists to react?
Actually, the hard part here, or the really scary part, is that I don't know. You don't know. That is, it's beyond my horizon to know if it's enough, or if you are really telling me the truth, or I couldn't know that. So that is the scary part, I think. And the way we as a journalist react is, the only thing I think we can react is by being more open and trying to be more, what do you say? Yeah, be more open, try more.
And do your journalists do they still continue to use the same platforms, same services, and promise anonymity or to whistleblowers, for example?
It's so difficult to say because we are so different between us. I'm not an investigating journalist. Yeah. My sources aren't in any government in that respect, but I also, the persons that are vulnerable to this is our fixers and helpers in different countries. And for obvious reasons, we do communicate with them through email and through Facebook and everything, and they don't have the ability or the knowledge most of the time to encrypt anything. But I'm not sure that it was actually a handfast or a physical act that really got my attention, how vulnerable they really are, because 2 years ago, last time I was in Afghanistan, my cell phone got stolen. Luckily for me, it wasn't me who was carrying my bag at that time, it was my fixer. For my conscious sake, it wasn't me who carried it. But anyway, it was stolen, and I thought that, well, it was a cell phone. Luckily, it wasn't us. But he was really upset and afraid, because he said that you had my telephone number in that cell phone and my name. And I didn't think about that should be a problem. But for him, he was really, really scared. I have had contact with him since, so nothing has happened. But that just to show you a picture of how bad things could be, and that is only a cell phone. Imagine how I put my picture up on Facebook because my company want that. Not my picture, but where we are and showing a little bit from behind the scenes. My company want that, for us to tell the viewers a little bit more behind the scenes. But as soon as I do that, everybody can see exactly where I am. It's right there. And it doesn't matter how precautious we are regarding, the kidnapping yeah, in Afghanistan, for example, again, it's you have to be very, very careful so that your car can't wait for you outside in the street, and you can't wait for the car outside on the street either. So you have to coordinate that. But we take a lot of precautions in order not to be kidnapped. But as soon as I put up any pictures on Facebook, the exact location comes up, exactly where I am and my name and everything. So it doesn't matter how precautious we are in physical world, because it's there. So, and I don't know how to respond to that. I don't know how to behave, what way I should behave to yeah. So.
Yes. Very provocative questions and no clear answers. But it is really an interesting and natural progression to Dean, who has been involved in training. And G Media Center is known to have trained journalists on human rights issues. So do you think that the ball is in actually the turf of the journalists, not in technology companies, or is it in both fields?
I would say it's a combination of both. There is steps that journalists can take in doing the encryption, but as Alina said, it's very difficult. It's the same technology that's existed for a number of years, and it was built by geeks for geeks. So it's you need to have a technology degree and be a journalist in order to figure out how to protect yourself. On the other side, even though we've dealt with journalists mainly from developing countries, and I can say I recall a journalist from Tunisia back in 2012 saying how they're aware of the need to encrypt and have encrypted communications constantly, whereas, coming from Western societies, we just assume everything's okay. Nothing is happening here. Well, since the Snowden revelations, that's completely changed things. And, now things are going to become more secure because we're aware that it's not just happening in places like China or Russia or other places. And this brings it to the other side, to the companies that control the information. It's easy for them to say that they try to make things secure. They have, different policies in place, but they're still the ones that have all the information. They keep that information. It's not going to disappear. Like you were saying earlier, it's a doubling effect. Everything is there, but it's not disappearing. So as soon as something is put out there, that information is available. And I guess from a journalist perspective, is to try and, bring and keep the information from the sources private, because it is a security issue for the journalists themselves. It would be in the interest of these companies that control the information not to store that information or have that information live on forever, for one thing, and not to have it all in one spot. There's no reason for these companies to hold that information other than it's their business model. They make money from it. That's the way it is. That's the way it'll always be. But there's nothing saying legally that the government requires them to keep that information. But the governments would like access to that information. We could use examples from Research in Motion a few years ago. Their technology was so secure, the way they stored information, that United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, India were requiring them to disclose information that they did not even have, because their technologies did not store the information, so they didn't even have access to emails or other information because it was so secure. In the end, the Research in Motion ended up coming up with an agreement with these governments to keep their services, and it was just cited as national security issues. So it's both sides. It's up to journalists on the one side, it's up to these companies on the other side to try and keep the information secure or get rid of it. It's not an easy question. It's not something that's going to change overnight, but everybody involved needs to keep putting pressure on governments, on these companies, to come up with a solution. It's not an easy question to answer.
Okay. This brings us back to a recent initiative by the EU to acknowledge the right to be forgotten. And you may have followed the news about that. And if the EU is pushing for that, how would Google react? And another issue is whether you believe it's possible for switching on encryption end-to-end for every single Gmail, for example, user, to have that option by default and then perhaps turning it off if they not wish so. What are the challenges or opportunities of doing those things?
So a couple of different things. I wanted to comment also what my co-panelists comment on that, because I think it's really interesting. I mean, one of the things that I think that the NSA scandal really led to, which is deplorable, is this fact that we now start from a point of doubt, right? We feel very clearly that we don't know if you can trust people. So how can I know that you're not lying to me is a question I have gotten several times. And I think that, the one thing that I can keep repeating is that, no, we're not lying to you. We're actually doing all these things. And then you say, but I can't know. And you say, well, that's an epistemological question at some point. And yes, you cannot know anything with certainty. And I'm very sorry, but we are not doing any of that. And so I think that is a fundamental change that happens when surveillance is not designed in a way that's legitimate, when there's no transparency. The consequence of opacity, if we sort of take that as the opposite of transparency, is a fundamental, we sort of break a fundamental bond of trust in society that we need in order to develop as societies, both culturally, I think, and economically. So that is a really sad effect that we see a lot. And I think that on the question of sort of companies should delete the technology. There are a couple of different aspects of this that I think are interesting, where there is an interesting or a possibility for an interesting interplay between journalists and technology companies. What happened to RIM was essentially that a number of different countries required that they store their data locally so it would be easier to eavesdrop on. This is called data localization. And it's a common demand from governments that sometimes are less than democratic when it comes to how they want to conduct surveillance. It's something that we have seen being leveled at us, Facebook, Twitter, others have seen it as well. To see people protest against this and actually point to what it does would be brilliant. To see sort of journalists engage also in what these governments are doing, point it out and say that this is actually something that is done not for national security reasons, but only in order to be able to conduct surveillance that is far from legitimate on their own citizens. And I think that interplay, if we can sort of get to a point where we build a common understanding of what the journalistic protections are and also what the technical threats are, that dialogue needs to be developed far more than we've so far. When it comes to deletion, I think that it's really important also for technology companies to provide people with the ability to take their data out, right? If you at some point feel that I do not trust this provider, you should be able to leave. So we have a team in Chicago called the Data Liberation Front. I did not pick the name. So the Data Liberation Front. And the only thing they do is that they design a product called Takeout. And Google Takeout, I did not design that name either, is a product that allows you to take all of your stuff from Google and leave, and then have it deleted. And that essentially allows you to make an informed choice. Do I trust this company or not? Trust cannot be established unless you have the ability to walk away. It's a basic human relationship thing. I can't trust you if I'm forced to be with you in some way, right? But if you give me the opportunity to be free and leave, then trust can actually start to grow. And so this is another aspect of how you design your technology platforms that I think is quite important. On Gmail, it's actually encrypted end-to-end. We use SSL, secure socket layers, which is a technology that allows you to encrypt end-to-end, and we have used that since, I think it's 2007. It's been automatically default on, and which means that there's no middleman attack that can easily be...
just to clarify, I meant the encryption of the data itself in the email. So even Google doesn't know what's going on.
Right. So you can imagine a world in which you do that as well. And I think that there are plugins and there is software that you can do that with if you want to make sure that it's sort of encrypted also from us. Right now, that's not possible, and that's definitely an interesting avenue to explore. And we're always looking at all the different opportunities and options we have when it comes to making our users more secure. There's a little bit of a backdraw on that too. That is that if you lose the key, that's it. All of the information you had, there's no way that can be recovered. There's no way we can help you with that. And so maybe that should be a choice. Maybe you should have that choice, and maybe that's something you should do. It's a valid question. Now, other sort of encryption questions or technology questions, I think it's really important to remember that, Ron Rivest, who's one of the most well-known security researchers in the world, is the R of RSA, a huge encryption provider. He used to say that the basic problem that we have to keep people secure is that we have a problem with usability, because the more secure something becomes, if you imagine a graph like this, the less usable it becomes. And pushing this curve so we can get usable security is tremendously important, because that then goes to your point about encryption and how you do that in easy ways, etc. So I think that's also very important. Now, let's see. You had a question that I didn't answer in the beginning. What was the first question you asked?
The right to be forgotten. But
the right to be forgotten case. Yes, so we're just still, this happened last week. We're reading the judgment, trying to understand how to comply with the judgment and the decision, and figuring out what these different measures should be. I think there's a number of principled issues relating to that case, and one thing, and I have read the judgment, but I must say I'm still wrapping my mind around this. One thing I wonder about is this notion that information discovery, your ability to find information, is not protected as much as your ability to publish it. And I wonder if the court is striking that balance in the right way. So, for example, you can have a case in which it's quite legitimate for a newspaper to publish something, but not legitimate for Facebook to link to it, or for us to link to it in search, because that increases the information discoverability of that particular article. And that, to me, seems to be an awkward way to roll back the public sphere. Bracketing this by saying that I haven't read the judgment more than once and I need to figure it out, and we're looking at it as my personal view only. I think that seems to be an awkward way to lessen the public sphere if information discoverability is not protected. But that's sort of my own views.
Very interesting points. But Lena, you mentioned earlier an inability to understand technology, though you mentioned that technology built by geeks for geeks. Apparently, or is it you who mentioned that? Okay, sorry. Apparently there's but you mentioned the difficulty in using technology. That's what I meant. This puts a burden on journalists themselves, doesn't it? I mean, you can't stay with the same old ways when technology is overwhelmingly changing your reality. And don't you feel that journalists are to blame for not being up to date with technology uses or means of technology? Can't institutions establish a better training framework for them to be equipped with what they need to know about how to properly and securely use the technology?
Yes, we are to blame. But the difficult thing is that it's not only up to us, is it? I mean, I can encrypt my mails and Facebook, but if the other part doesn't encrypt their part, then it's useless, isn't it? I don't know really,
Yes,
but I think so. So it's not only up to us.
So what are the proposed solutions to this? I mean, you can't simply go on as usual.
No, but I don't think that the answer is more surveillance, more encryptions, more hiding behind bars. I don't think so. I think that the answer is more openness. I believe so. I don't know, but I think that is the end there of your...
Planning for freedom rather than for security.
Yeah.
Because security requires freedom.
I think that is...
Okay, I mean, but of course...
Maybe it's that an easy answer. I don't know, because I don't know the other options.
I understand the perspective, maybe that the issue of I'm being from a developing country myself, I would argue against that notion, because on many occasions, being open in an authoritarian dictatorship is not a good idea. I don't know if you can imagine the situation where speaking up would result in having you in jail. So it appears that while this is true in developed countries, the total opposite is the case in many dictatorships around the world.
I can understand what you mean, but that is the case, has been the case for centuries. I mean, that is not a new thing. It's always been like that, hasn't it? And I mean, on different levels. Now it's very, very, very easy to conduct the surveillance, but and it's rather the other way that it has tipped over to the developed world,
Yes.
isn't it? So I mean, it's like democracy. We would like everybody to have democracy, don't we? So why can't the option be that we want everybody to have an open society where you can be open with everything? We should. I think it's not. It might sound very easy to just say that we need more openness, but I think that is the direction we should strive for.
Interesting. Before we go to questions, a final thought from Dean about this. Do you believe that the policy regulation issue is totally crucial if we consider the fact that there are talks about internet governance forum talks about the surveillance being let's say, an illegal act by certain entities? Is that the course that we should pursue more than training and getting technology to be more adaptive?
I would say that it's, as Lena was mentioning, openness. I mean, in the end, it's going to come down to being more open. And of course, developing countries is a different situation. But at the same time, those developing countries are working towards more open society. The part about the regulation, my opinion would be that there needs to be some, for internet freedom, internet should be free, but there needs to be regulation on the part of the data collection and who has access to that data. It's, you know, it's one thing to collect the data and hold that data and then have governments come and just request infinite amounts of data. Like there's no reason for them to do that. I mean, they're targeting the whole world essentially instead of focusing on the people they need to be targeting for security reasons, not just a big grab of all the information that's there. It used to be easy or more difficult for, you know, information to get to security agencies, but through paper. Now it's basically a touch of a button and they can have endless amounts of information. So now they're overwhelmed with amounts of information they have, and it's easy for them to go to places like Google and say, give us all your information, and then, you know, spend countless hours trying to decipher that information. Meanwhile, they've missed their opportunity to focus on their security breach. And so I would say for regulation, it needs to be more on the targeting of the information that's stored.
Very useful. So I believe we have facilitators here, so perhaps we could ask the floor to present questions and commentary of what had happened. So whoever wishes to intervene is welcome. Don't be shy now. Yes, there's a question here. Is there a mic? No, I can present you so everyone would hear.
Yeah, I'm Roland Stonebridge. I'm just wondering whether companies like Google notice a decreasing lack of trust from the public. Because the other day I was sitting with someone, a student, who had installed a small program on her computer which would let her know if some outside company or whatever was trying to access what she was doing. And she noticed all sorts of things. You open Microsoft Word and suddenly it wants to connect just to write something, a letter, or write in a document. a request to report to somewhere. Apple, the same thing. Or Google Plus wants to access the confidential information in your keychain, whatever that might mean. And she would just click on no or deny, 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 because why were all these requests coming? But what was really behind it was her mistrust of being watched.
Interesting question too. Nicholas, I guess that's to you.
Naturally. So I think a couple of different answers there. We have noticed an overall, this sort of shift to the point of doubt that Lena was talking about, I think is something that we've noticed overall. It's not only about companies, by the way. I think it's equally directed to, and it might be even more corrosive for governments.
A microphone.
Because governments are in a situation where their citizens suddenly find out that they can't trust what they've done. And even between governments. I don't know if you followed the news cycle about what the GCHQ did for the, I think it was the G8 meeting, where they sort of put internet computers up and then they simply recorded everything that was written in those internet computers. So the level of trust in our global society overall, I think, is actually gone down over this. And that is the fundamental tragedy of illegitimate surveillance. What happens when it becomes known, and it always becomes known, I think the chance, because it's a good thing, for it to become known is actually increased with the internet. Because if somebody chooses to disclose the fact that illegitimate surveillance happens, it spreads much faster. So the internet actually helps there. But I think there's an overall lowering of trust in governments, certainly also in companies, but perhaps in the technology itself. You see, we are discussing here is encryption enough? What do you do? She installs this program. Does she know who actually made that program? I mean, this is in some way something that is quite interesting, because I think that our relationship with technology, again, Heidegger says something really interesting about technology. He says that you don't notice a hammer until it breaks, because it's an extension of your arm when you're hammering, but when it breaks, then it suddenly becomes a thing. Now, what I think happened with the Snowden revelation is that the internet became a thing. We were sort of embedded in it, we were enmeshed in it, we were using it all the time. Suddenly it broke. Something in it broke, right? We saw that it was not what we thought it was. And we took a step back. And that's the kind of distrust that I think is something we now have to work to repair. I hope that's an answer.
Yeah. So the microphone is there. Whoever has an intervention or question or comment is welcome. Yep, there's.
Hi, we've spoken about...
if you introduce yourself.
Hi,
So
my name's Emma Cullen. I'm a student here. I studied Journalism Connected last year. We've spoken about watching the watchers, and a lot of the time we speak about the government being the watchers. But journalists who watch the government supposedly also have access to surveillance technology, and it's clear that in particular large media houses have used this surveillance technology for evil. So for example, in Britain, the phone hacking that newspapers are doing, what can journalists and big media houses do, or what should they do to stop other journalists or big media houses from using this technology for evil?
is that question meant to particular?
Yeah.
Whoever's the evil media.
Evil media, yeah. Evil media. Evil media.
Isn't that a question of moral? I mean, simple moral. I think it's not. They are behaving in a bad way, and the way that they shouldn't. And most media are not behaving in that way, are not using surveillance techniques like that. I don't know what else to say about that. And they were discovered and are prosecuted. We have laws against that, and I think that is enough.
No, along the similar lines, it's something that bad that happened. It shouldn't have happened, and again, it's society learning about new technologies, and in this case, someone tried to take advantage of these new technologies, and they shouldn't have. Journalists are very ethical people, and in this case, it was just a bad choice. And I think, this is, good example of how things are going to change because, you know, society is aware, watching the watchers, and in this case, that's how this found out. And so I think, yeah, I think it's one of those things that bad choice, and the laws will deal with it, and hopefully it won't happen again.
Yes, Rupa?
Just around the revelation of the...
And your name? so
My name
everyone-
is Ruba Al-Helo. I come from Lebanon. I'm a media lecturer and a freelance journalist. It's related to the question, actually, that the lady just asked. Rupert Murdoch actually commented on this after the revelation, and he said media lost its power. And I think somehow it's true, because it's no longer the fourth power. It's no longer that the responsibility of the media. It's the engagement of the social media. It's the engagement of the whole thing around crowdsourcing, around getting the information. So we're not, as journalists, the source anymore. We're not the medium anymore, as Marshall McLuhan would say. The medium has changed. It has more different divergence now. What do you think?
So the power of the media is lost, perhaps.
Yes.
Yes. You want to contribute?
So I think that it is probably true that the way we think about what a journalist is, the definition of the concept has changed over time, especially since you can add crowdsourcing to the mix and sort of get your sources from a lot of different people, and you can use social media to validate, or you can use social media even to generate ideas about what to say. I see, you know, in social media flows, I see a lot of people, for example, tweeting, I'm going on TV tonight, what should I ask X? So this sort of set of interview questions that used to be meticulously prepared is now being crowdsourced, and you get it from Twitter, to a small degree, certainly. I mean, I think they prepare still. But it does sort of change what a journalist is. And it also changes, of course, the locus of who has the information. Because there might be situations where a journalist does not have a first-hand source, but a second-hand source from, say, social media. And what that requires, I think, and where the role of a journalist remains intact, is that the journalist still needs to figure out how do I actually make sure that the information I produce is qualitative, that it still has the high level of quality that I want it to have, if I'm relying on a set of 2,000 people who crowdsource something for me. It's sort of the Guardian problem is interesting there, right? Because the Guardian took all of the expenses from the MEPs, they put them out on the web, and then they had people just go through and sift through the material, and they would pull out whatever looked bad, and they would send it to the journalist. Now, if you're the journalist, do you just take that then and say, thank you, crowdsource, and publish it? Or do you have a process whereby which you go through and validate the information again? And I think that's where the situation for a journalist is different, that getting the information, which might have been sort of what you were trying to before, is now easier, but validating it is infinitely harder. Is that?
Yes, basically it goes to the question of ethics now, which is also a question worldwide. What should we do? What shouldn't we do, actually? It depends on values and norms.
Very good. By the way, she has an upcoming participation in the panel, so she'll help us explore that dimension. Thank you. Others?
Hi, my name is Elin Häggberg. I'm a student here and also with the college radio here at Örebro University, Radio Campus. I have a question about what do you think about like the security about like new technology and the usability for journalists and other people? Like, it's possible now to do things faster and to send things fast and communicate fast, but also, like Lina was talking about, the Facebook pictures, like it can also be a security issue. Like, how are we going to work those things so that we can do things fast and do things easy without, because security also sometimes makes things harder. Like, you have to have longer passwords and more security to keep things secure, but still you want it to be fast and usable.
That is one of the problems that I really tried to express in the beginning, actually. It's so hard to use those different tools that you have to actually use them or to implant them and everything. And yeah, it's a problem, but I also think that we are slowly learning. We are slowly learning what we can do and what we can't do, and how we can protect ourselves on a level that we can live with. So, and everything has pros and cons, you know. It gives us a great opportunity that things are so easily accessed, that we are getting information so quickly, and we're getting so much information from so many sources that we can use so quickly. So but I think I might be too optimistic here, I don't know, but I think we're slowly learning just on what level we have to be fairly secure, but also being able to get access to that information that we want.
There's one thing I would like to add, is that essentially there are, ways to be secure. Like you say, we want things fast, we want things now. When we say that, we need to add to that, we want things free. I mean, if you want to be secure, you can be secure. You're going to have to pay for it. Those tools are available, and you could be secure, but we want things to be free. We don't want things that you have to pay for. So, I mean, there's also that side to it.
A couple.
My name is Anna Roxvall. I'm a freelance journalist, and I'm going to be in the panel in the afternoon. But I was thinking about that question that was raised earlier about the hacking of the phone records, basically, right? And I mean, I don't really have a question. It's just a point I'm trying to make. Is that as a journalist, we do have a bit of an ethical problem here that is rising, because we do consider ourselves to have the right to actually break a few rules if it's for a better cause, when it comes to actually exposing a government, for example, doing something wrong or something like that. And the laws are very difficult already. And when you get into a point where you might actually get hold of, let's say, phone records or credit card details, for example, showing that a very high-rise politician or someone is misusing public funds in an extreme way. I mean, how do you deal with that? I mean, I don't have an answer to that, but I think that we are going to see more and more of these issues where actually the answer is not just clear-cut, like this is a matter of like ethics and this is yes and this is no. I mean, I think we're going to see much more of that in the future, because we might get hold of things that we shouldn't, but from hackers and people like that. And is that a whistleblower then, or is it a source? Is it illegal? I mean, yeah, I'm gonna finish that, but I'm just saying that I don't think it's a very easy thing to answer right now, considering the way technology goes right now.
And just to add to it, it's going to get worse because there's a black market for information as well, so you can buy some of this stuff. So the question then becomes, do you pay for access to information that can show, for example, something that is of journalistic value? And so I think that's a valuable discussion to have long term, but I don't know any answers to it.
Well, I mean, this is exactly what's coming out from the Snowden revelations. It's exactly what you're talking about. And one of the things to keep in mind with regards to journalists is that it's now, because of all this information and ease of access, it's very easy for them to be associated on social media with a wealth of different people. And now it's difficult. It's not so easy anymore for governments and people questioning journalists to say, disclose your sources. And journalists cannot just say, we're not going to disclose our sources. They're now being asked, are you a co-conspirator with such and such a person, because we have records of all these communications. So this is also another aspect to things affecting journalists today.
My name is Gunnar Klein. I'm a professor of informatics here at Örebro University. I've spent a lot of time trying to introduce encryption techniques into healthcare. And today, if you are communicating sensitive patient data, you don't use unencrypted email. But journalists still do. And these techniques have been available for 20 years. And you are saying as individual journalists that this is difficult, and I understand that because it is a bit difficult now, but I think you as journalists should put the requirements on your media organizations, the companies. They should provide you with the technology support, just like diplomats are given secure ways of communicating both with your cell phones and when you're using email. Today, if also when it's not just for your safety, but it's of course about your informers. Today, if you want to leak things to WikiLeaks, you can get a way of providing that in a secure way. But for most Swedish media houses, they have no published way of communicating without revealing your identity or making it easy for the watchers to listen into the messages. So I think you as a group should put demand on your organization that their technology support people should give you the tools to at least make it more difficult for the watchers. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're right. Of course, we should be more precautious and we should take those steps to be more secure. But today it's not only the emails, it's the Facebook and FaceTime or whatever. You communicate Skype. How do you encrypt Skype? I don't know. I mean,
it's already encrypted per se.
But they can see who I
supposedly you don't really know for sure, but you can if you trust them. They say it's encrypted end to end.
Microsoft company, not coming.
Yeah.
But my point is that there's so many channels today that it's yes we can stop one channel or 2 or 3 or 4, but stop every channel, it's very hard. But we should take those steps through that we can take.
Yes, a question here. Pass the mic.
Hi, my name is Aris. I study human-computer interaction at Uppsala University. Listening to Lina, actually, I can relate much that nowadays people are having difficulties to have a proper model on how people actually store data and everything. What does it mean to have data in the cloud, and how does encryption work? Who owns this data and who has access to it? And I'm starting to think that whose responsibility actually it is. Is it the education? Is it the companies that stores the data to actually educate and make people aware on what they're committing? As we probably know that end user agreement sometimes not enough to make people aware of what is actually that they sign up to. So I don't know, maybe Lina can also add something that what can we do, like what is the role of the technologies and the education maybe to help like different practitioners to be more aware of what it is actually means with this nowadays structure of information. Thanks.
Yeah, so I think I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think actually the companies have a responsibility to try to figure out, especially for exposed groups. So there's, for example, the Electronic Frontier Foundation has a training program for journalists from authoritarian states where they go through and they show how you can encrypt all your email, how you can hide it, how you make sure that you create different kinds of spaces on your computer not easily discoverable, etc., etc. And so we have been participating in that together with other companies, and I think there's a lot of work being done for those groups. Now, when it comes to the wider user set, it's equally important that they have the opportunity to protect themselves. And one of the things where you actually run into a problem is sort of this user agreement. You need to explain exactly what is happening. So for a while ago, a number of different companies, ours was one, we started developing something called human readable agreements. Now, the lawyers were not happy about that because sort of implied that they weren't humans. So the law department still doesn't talk to me. Now, so but the idea was, this is important. we need to communicate it in a good way, and we need to make sure that we communicate what the different priorities are. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done there in user education and user awareness about what happens, for example, when you check into a location or when you share something on a social network, etc. And that's something where I think that there's an argument for basic digital literacy being taught in schools, and really just walking through, this is what happens, this is the availability, and these are your rights should something not go the way you want it to. There is too little of that today, I think, and certainly I think a place like Sweden would be very well placed to start testing that in schools.
Good. More thoughts? Yes, there's a question here.
Hello, my name is Claudia Prikop, and I am a communications professional and part-time journalist. I have a question for Niklas, and it's related to wearable technology. Google Glasses, as far as I know, or to my knowledge, one can now, or the one who wears them can basically document information just by moving the eyes, right? Or by blinking. And I was wondering, to what extent can we actually trust wearable technology or instant technology that our privacy is not disclosed without our consent?
So I think that with all new technologies, we negotiate a new social contract. We need to figure out what works and what doesn't. When it comes to Google Glass, Astro Teller, who is the head of Google X, where it was developed, has said quite consciously several times, and I think he's right, that the reason we're not releasing this worldwide, or that we did not release it worldwide immediately, but only in small batches, was that we think it's necessary to have a normative discussion about how this technology is used. So rather than just unleashing it, we need to talk about how this technology is used. One early thing we did was we said no face recognition on Google Glass, for example. Astro was quite clear about that because he felt that that was an inappropriate technology. Another thing that is very interesting and very clear is sort of the sounds that you hear from technology when it uses something. The shutter sound of a camera, for example, when you take a picture, is a clear signal that a picture is being taken. Those cues, those social cues, are important to introduce into technology in different ways. After a while, I think if you look at the history of technology, we develop these norms. In some cases, we think legislation is necessary. In some cases, we're satisfied with norms. The best example that I know is the mobile phone. So the mobile phone, for example, in California, it's prohibited to speak on your mobile phone whilst you're driving, which is a good idea, by the way, because I see lots of people driving like crazy when they're talking on the phones. But it's not prohibited to speak on your mobile phone when you're in a restaurant. One is dangerous to others, one is a nuisance. But what has happened is, if you go to a Californian restaurant that's medium to good, what you will see at the end of the menu is they say, we really appreciate your voicemail taking your messages whilst you're here. Subtle social cue. As if you were speaking on the phone, you're being a bit of an ass. Don't do that. And I think all technology need to develop down that path, sort out what's legal, what's norms, and develop those norms. And the question in Google Glass case is it possible to find a release way in which you can actually encourage that normative development or not? And we're experimenting with that, and we're hoping that will happen. Now, you will see a lot of more wearable technology down the road, and I think that's clearly one of the big trends that also follows the sinking price of sensors, for example. So that's where I think that ends up.
And that's clearly one of the challenges, I guess, in terms of wearable technology, to be able to address these privacy issues that might arise, basically. And I was wondering whether there are like any ways to address this, to make sure that, okay, we can develop wearable technology and still make sure that we reduce or diminish the ethical concerns as far as possible.
I think the release process and the normative information is sort of a broad social way of trying to handle some of those concerns. The other things is essentially also making sure that certain applications are not developed, or that you have those social cues like sounds, etc. And I do believe that it's a valuable discussion for us to have. We have now demonstrated Google Glass across Europe to lots of different decision makers and been listening to them just to understand what they think the concerns are. And we're bringing that back to Google X and to make sure that they know what those concerns are too. Now, the Google Glass in itself contains no technology that is qualitatively new, that did not exist before in your mobile phone. But it exists in a slightly different way, right? These are not Google Glass, don't worry. So but sort of, and I think that the thing there is that even when we assemble existing technologies into new formats, like we do in wearable technology, we are actually asking new questions around those technologies, and I think that's a sound thing, and we should continue asking them.
Thank you. Any more questions or thoughts? There's still some time for one more.
Just keeping the row here. Hello, my name is Louise Rupke. I'm a current student of the Master of Global Journalism. And actually, I have a question to Lena and you, because how see journalists Google? Is it a useful tool, or is it dangerous to you because it's like collecting all the information which your journalist has been collecting before? Like, it would be very interesting how media researchers and journalists see Google.
How we see Google?
Yeah, is it a tool or a danger to your job, for instance?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, performance review. How are we doing?
No, but I use Google every day, every second, I think. I mean, I use Google all the time. I don't use anything else than Google. So what should I say? No, but what I was thinking about was a question to you actually about that is now we're about the surveillance of the phone tracking thing in Britain. We have laws. You can't do that actually. They got prosecuted. But here we are dependent on that you are an ethical, moral company, and how do we deal with that? We are dependent on that.
Yes.
You say you are, and I have
Yes, we do, and no. Here's the thing: we also operate under legislation, of course. There is.
Of course, but I mean those things about the gold glasses and everything. There's a little bit gray zone there, aren't there?
No. So I actually think that when something new happens, there's always going to be a sort of time for the law to interpret it, like we saw in the ECJ case, for example, and the right to be forgotten. But all of the laws that apply, so the 9546 EC directive on data protection and privacy, applies to us and applies to all these new technologies too. To the extent that you consider the collection of data for Google Glass to be personal data, those laws apply. And so we are actually operating not only under those laws, but also under the equal laws in the United States. And in aggregate, we're under every single market where we're present and their legislation. So it's not as if it's a lawless country or something like that. I think the more important, not the more important, but another important question is how do you make sure that you actually interpret these laws when you design technology? And that's partly why we have teams like the one I'm on. I'm not an engineer. There are several others that are not engineers, and what we do essentially is that we look at the new technology proposals from our folks and we say, look, this is great, this is what you should think about from a social perspective, and then we have a set of lawyers, and Google actually invented a new kind of lawyer, which is a weird kind of innovation. And the new kind of lawyer we have is something called a product counsel. A product counsel is only involved in a technology, or mostly involved in technology until it's launched. And what that person does is that they walk along the entire development path together with the engineers, making sure that the technology is designed within the realm of the law. It's as if you would have a lawyer sort of hanging out with you when you were doing your reporting, just checking that you were not hacking any phones.
Okay, but
Do you have that?
yeah. No, I haven't. Back to your question there, because I have been thinking about it, of course, because you knew that Google puts up the most exposed, what would you say? The thing that comes in the top when you are searching for something is that most people are searching for, isn't it? Yeah, so of course I've been thinking about it, but I'm a journalist, I only have questions here. I don't know what to do about it, actually. Yeah. Really. But that is on my mind, but further than that I haven't really...
And you can ask the question later in the break, in case she gives a more thorough answer. And now we have only 1 minute, perhaps a few seconds for everyone to round up or wrap up and give a final statement. So where should we start? Nicholas, here? Yes, you can start with Dean. Yep, you can.
Yeah, so I guess from my perspective, I would like to see a lot of involvement from civil society and different action groups to keep pressure on different companies, governments, to move forward with new technologies in this case, and ensure that not only citizens but journalists are protected and their data is protected, and that's where I see the need for protection. It's on the data that's collected, and how it gets distributed is where the underlying issues lie.
Thank you. Lena?
Yeah, I think it's important that we are really not afraid to publish. We are open, and that we are creating complete safe routes for whistleblowers to be able to communicate with us. And in general, that we're not afraid to both publish and that the ceilings within the media houses are as high as they are now, or should be. What do I say? I'm not sure that they are that high right now, because we are all afraid. There's a lot of newspapers that are shut down, and well, yeah, I can't explain this, but fearlessness and work.
Thank you.
So I will end my with a plea, and that plea is that I think it's tremendously important that we talk about technologies, educating journalists on how to use secure technologies, etc., etc. I think one thing that would be equally good would be if journalists could come back and sort of tell technologies what kind of threats, especially in authoritarian states, they're facing, and how to deal with them, and what would be really helpful. So we have had that interaction with a series of dissidents in an informal working group, where they've told us what works and what doesn't, and they can alert us to if they think somebody's account is being hijacked, etc. But that dialogue can be so much broader and so much deeper, where technologies get to understand more about the actual practice and the perils of journalism. I think that's sort of the plea I'd like to end on.
Thank you. Well, at the very end, I'd like to give them an applause for having been open.